So today I'm finally gonna clean this like mess of a box that just has a shit ton of cables in it that I've needed to clean for a long time, but while I do that I figured I would address something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. So sometimes I feel this dissonance between having millions of people who view the content that I produce with For First to 11 and then having a pretty unassuming day-to-day life. I mean, we pretty regularly talk about in interviews or in Patreon calls how we're not really ever recognized in public. And in a lot of ways, I'm actually really grateful for this, because a lot of famous people have said before that they just openly don't want to be famous. That's a line that once you cross it, it's hard to go back on. But then you have to ask yourself, why do some famous people say that they don't want to be famous anymore? Well, maybe we should start with, why do people even want to grow a fan base in the first place? I mean, my instance is a little bit interesting because for me, the stuff that is famous or well-known, you would say, is the music I make, but it's not necessarily me, for example. But shouldn't that be enough? I mean, really, you have to ask yourself if this is narcissistic. But that actually has been studied in some detail, especially by Dara Greenwood at the Vassar Psychology Department. And it turns out that there's three main components to this desire or calling to be famous: validation, finances, and altruism. So there's a more focused way to define those three components. And in order of their allure to being famous, number one is going to be the need to feel seen or valued. After that is going to be the perceived status that comes with being famous. And after that is going to be pro-social motivation. All three of these components, by the way, are very deeply entangled with our narcissistic behavior and the need to relate to others. So Greenwood categorizes her subjects in this experiment. Like I said, one would be the proclivity towards narcissistic behavior, and one would be their need to relate to others. And the way they measured them was on this axis of either frequency of fantasizing about fame, and then the perceived realism of becoming famous. So those categorized by their narcissism scored highly in those first two components I mentioned about wanting to be famous. The perceived status, the validation, and they also interestingly scored extremely highly in their perceived realism of becoming famous. So they really think very optimistically about their chances. And then those in the other category, the need to relate to others, scored really highly in everything except for their perceived realism of fame. In other words, they just daydreamed about being famous. Oh my God. Likely that's just because they were trying to escape their sort of realities that they were living in. The through line for both groups of people, though, was their need to be validated. What you say? So here's where the pro-social motivation comes in. Those who scored highly in their need to relate to others really just wanted to be famous because they wanted to bring up other people in their social network. And it's also very important to mention that the need to relate to others is not synonymous with the need to belong. They all cited that they feel very well established and welcomed in their social network with their friends, their family, their colleagues, whatever. But they really just wanted to be famous so that they could help them out. So trying to improve the well-being or living conditions of those that they really care about. In 2012, UCLA researchers found that lots of pre-adolescents aged 10 to 12 hold being famous as a long-term aspiration. And not only that, but being famous just for the sake of being famous was really important to them. So important that it superseded things like being rich or having your dream job or even Robux. It kind of makes sense also because at that age, the human need to just feel accepted by our peers is just beginning to form. So thinking about being famous when you're 10 to 12 kind of satiates that need. So even though I'm not 12 anymore, maybe I'm just looking for some peer-to-peer validation. Because, I mean, I can admit that it feels really good when my shit blows up. But there's another really important aspect to this conversation. And that's extrinsic versus intrinsic motivations. The fancy terms for these are process-focused and outcome-focused. It kind of makes you wonder, which one are you? I mean, what's your reason for wanting to be the most recognizable person at your local coffee shop? So speaking from an outcome-focused point of view, would be like saying, I really want to be famous because I desire to be the most recognizable person in a room. And not only that, I really want others to just profess their belief in my importance for me, because that's just a desirable outcome, no matter how I get there. Being more process-focused would be saying that being famous really just means to have lots of opportunities, and lots of opportunities not just for yourself, but for others around you, people who you think are great content creators, or people that you think just work really hard and deserve to have a platform. Basically, if you have high social or societal value, you can use that to greatly improve the living conditions of others. So for me personally, that would look like fast-tracking some of my music students into their careers, or playing shows for charities that would actually make a big difference, or giving livable wages to people that I know in the music industry. Both of those things are very true, but here's somewhere in the middle that probably makes the most sense. I hope that what I create, which is usually musical, appeals to a wide net of people, both for their genuine interest in my art form and also for the impact that it could leave somebody. The desire to be the most recognizable person in the room is really a split between hoping that people will appreciate my creative process and then also the outcome of that creative process, which usually is a song that I've written or a video I've made. And of course, having the opportunities afforded to famous people is really attractive. I mean, I'd love to have multiple ways that I can pivot my career and in the process also bring people with me that I really love working with. And to do it outside the bounds of financial limitations, well, I mean, my dad, Dr. Gilman, always says, rich or poor, it's nice to have money. There are, of course, some pretty irrefutable pitfalls to being famous. In this article from Donna Rockwell, we're kind of reminded that some really famous people who had an untimely death, like Michael Jackson, River Phoenix, or Whitney Houston, all had some pretty sad through lines, like their proclivity towards substance abuse, their social dysfunction, or their dissociation with their real self versus their famous self. And I don't think any of us would choose that. Or would you? I mean, is that worth it? Could you have your dream car if that's what it took? Your dream 911 Sport Classic in British racing green with houndstooth seats and a ducktail spoiler? Okay, no, but seriously. Imagine if there was a fame machine that you could step in, and it was perfectly calibrated to whatever you want to sacrifice in accordance with whatever you're really looking to gain. I mean, would you step in? I mean, in a way we already do. We participate in social media, which 9 out of 10 doctors will say is bad for your mental health, but it's an opportunity like you've never really been given before in the history of the human race to become famous through this path of very little resistance. And it's important because it's a metric for how we decide to wager our desire to be fame versus whatever negative impacts it might have on you. I'll probably cap it there on the social media thing though. That could be its whole own video. This is just kind of a side note, but a celebrity that I really respect would probably be Ed Sheeran. Ed Sheeran has kind of positioned himself in this way where he doesn't have to participate in things like social media to maintain his relevance in pop culture, it seems, but also he's just really high in pro-social motivation. I mean, he's frequently giving his crew members really nice gifts or even just bailing them out of hard financial situations, but I digress. If you're worried about not having enough altruistic motivations for being famous, there's no need to just drop off the face of the earth. I think that reality is kind of between the spot of these thoughts that we can't escape that make you feel really guilty, and then these actions that we actually choose to live. So if you clicked on this video, you're probably somewhere where I am, just in the middle of these two things, being very enticed by the opportunity, but still kind of tantalized, wondering if you're a piece of shit for wanting to be famous. But you're probably just in your own head.
Oh, shit!